These are the conflicts that shaped Chuck Connor's career. Feuds with creators, sponsors, and even his own co-stars that reveal a man whose principles consistently cost him everything. Most people remember Chuck Connors as Lucas McCain, the sharpshooting widower from The Rifleman, but behind that wholesome television image lived a strong-willed personality who clashed with Hollywood's establishment in ways that cut short what could have been a legendary career. What we're exploring today is the most documented conflict of Connor's professional life, a feud that wasn't with a co-star or rival actor, but with the very creator of his own television show. Political ideology, corporate sponsors, and one man's stubborn refusal to compromise destroyed a partnership and ended a series that should have run for 5 years. Some context about who Chuck Connors was beyond the rifle and the cowboy hat makes sense here. Kevin Joseph Aloysius Connors was born on April 10, 1921 in Brooklyn, New York, and he stood 6 feet 5.5 inches tall, an imposing figure by any standard. Before he ever stepped in front of a camera, professional athletics defined his life, playing both Major League Baseball and in the NBA. Only 13 athletes have ever played both sports professionally, and Connors was one of them. Television made him a household name. The Rifleman premiered in 1958 and ran for 5 seasons, making Connors one of the most recognizable faces in American living rooms. Over the course of 168 episodes, the show consistently ranked in the top 20 programs. For a generation of Americans, Chuck Connors wasn't just an actor, he was a symbol of frontier justice and American values. What many people didn't know was that Connors was also a committed conservative Republican, campaigning for Barry Goldwater in 1964, marching in support of the Vietnam War in 1967, and maintaining personal friendships with Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan defined his political life. Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev, apparently a huge fan of the Rifleman, even became his friend, and Connors once presented him with engraved Colt .45 revolvers at Nixon's Western White House in 1973. This political background becomes absolutely necessary to understand what happened next. After The Rifleman ended in 1963, Chuck Connors needed his next big project. Branded, a Western series that premiered on NBC in January 1965, became that project. On the surface, it looked like another conventional Western, with Connors playing Captain Jason McCord, a cavalry officer wrongly accused of cowardice and drummed out of the service. Each week, McCord would wander the frontier trying to clear his name while helping people along the way. Branded wasn't what it appeared to be. Larry Cohen, the show's creator, had designed it as something far more subversive, a hidden allegory about the Hollywood Blacklist and McCarthyism. Cohen would later explain his intentions in an interview with The Village Voice published on August 2, 2018. His words were clear. The Blacklist was still around when I started writing for TV, so when I did Branded, I thought, okay, here's a way to talk about that. We'll have this cavalry officer who's been accused of being a coward, and we'll see how that affects his life. And it worked out great, until Chuck Connors found out what it was really about and wanted me off the show because I was some kind of dangerous radical. Cohen had created Jason McCord as a stand-in for blacklisted Hollywood professionals, people unjustly accused and destroyed by the House Un-American Activities Committee. The entire show was a critique of the very political forces that Connors' friends Nixon and Reagan had supported. When Connors discovered what Cohen was really doing, the ideological divide became unbridgeable. Chuck Connors, who had campaigned for one of the most conservative presidential candidates in American history, was starring in a show that secretly sympathized with accused communists and radicals. From Connors' perspective, Cohen wasn't just a writer with different politics. He was, in Connors' own words, some kind of dangerous radical. The fallout came immediately and brutally. Larry Cohen was marginalized from his own creation during the first season, though he retained creator credit, and producer Andrew A. Finati was brought in to rescue the show. According to David Fury's biography, Chuck Connors, the man behind the rifle, Finati fired everyone in the editing department, canceled all the directors they had scheduled, and made it clear to everyone, including Chuck, that he was the boss. Watching Branded from beginning to end reveals this shift happening right on screen. The early episodes, under Larry Cohen's supervision, dealt with complex questions about the nature of cowardice and what exactly makes a man a man. They were cerebral, morally ambiguous, and designed to make viewers think about justice and false accusations. The second season became something completely different, straightforward Western action with none of Cohen's political subtext. What had been designed as a commentary on McCarthyism became just another cowboy series. Pushing Larry Cohen off the show wasn't the end of Chuck Connors' problems with Branded. That was just the beginning. Procter & Gamble, one of the biggest corporate sponsors in television, sponsored Branded. They bankrolled the show's Sunday 8:30 p.m. time slot and expected their star to cooperate with promotional obligations, which meant public appearances, sponsor events, and the kind of corporate glad-handing that came with being the face of a primetime television series. Chuck Connors refused. Multiple sources confirm that Connors declined to make the promotional appearances that Procter & Gamble expected. He prioritized his autonomy over the corporate relationship, and Procter & Gamble didn't take it well. Here's the kicker. Branded was actually doing well in the ratings. Ranking number 14 in its first season meant it was a strong performer by any measure, and in a normal situation, a show ranking in the top 15 would expect renewal after renewal. This wasn't a normal situation. Procter & Gamble was furious at Connors for his refusal to cooperate, and they pulled their sponsorship, which meant the show was canceled after just 48 episodes, 2 seasons. Larry Cohen later reflected on what happened. Even though the show was among the top 10 or 12 shows, actually number 14 in the first season, it ended up getting canceled after 2 seasons because the sponsors at Procter & Gamble were furious at him. Otherwise, I think Branded would have run for 5 years. 5 years. Connors cost himself 5 years of steady work, 5 years of income, 5 years at the center of American television by refusing to play the corporate game. And here's the most revealing part of the whole story. Years later, as Chuck Connors' career declined and work became harder to find, he reached out to Larry Cohen, and according to Tony Williams' book, Larry Cohen, Radical Allegories of an Independent Filmmaker, the two men spoke. Connors admitted something remarkable, telling Cohen, "If I had just treated the sponsor a little better, I might have had a few more seasons." That's as close to an apology as Chuck Connors ever got. He knew he'd made a mistake, knew his stubbornness had cost him, but by then the damage was done. The Larry Cohen conflict wasn't the only time someone close to Chuck Connors blamed a third party for derailing his career. Patricia Blair, who played Lou Mallory on The Rifleman, had her own theory about why that show ended prematurely. Blair claimed that Chuck Connors' second wife, an Indian actress named Kamala Devi, was the real reason The Rifleman didn't get a 6th season. Connors had just married Devi on April 10, 1963, after meeting her on the set of the film Geronimo in 1962. Blair's words were blunt. Chuck had just married an actress from India named Kamala Devi. She felt that Chuck was above being in a Western series and wanted him to portray a sophisticated, educated character who wore a suit and tie. So he opted out and immediately signed to do a new police/crime series called Arrest and Trial. Blair added a particularly cutting assessment. Once you took Chuck out of his tight-fitting Western shirt with the sleeves rolled up, he lost all his sex appeal. Plans for a 6th season of The Rifleman actually existed. Episodes would expand to hour-long formats filmed in color, and the storyline would finally have Lucas McCain marry Lou Mallory. That's what the audience wanted, to see these characters get their happy ending. Connors pivoted to Arrest and Trial instead, which lasted exactly 1 season. 1 season versus what could have been multiple additional years of The Rifleman. Whether Patricia Blair's accusation about Kamala Devi is entirely fair remains uncertain, but what we do know is that Connors made another career decision that cost him, and this one may have been influenced by his personal life rather than his politics. Despite these documented conflicts, Chuck Connors wasn't universally difficult or hated in Hollywood. His most important professional relationship proves that. Johnny Crawford played his son, Mark McCain, across all 168 episodes of The Rifleman. Just a kid when the show started, he spent 5 formative years working alongside Connors nearly every day. Crawford's assessment of Connors was complicated but ultimately affectionate. In an interview with AMC, Crawford put it this way: "I had great respect for him and I loved working with him, but he was very different off-screen. He was incorrigible, a practical joker. It was fun all the time, but he wasn't a good influence on me, aside from his acting. He used a lot of 4-letter words, and he was very imposing. He loved intimidating people. I got a kick out of him." When asked if he viewed Connors as a father figure, he simply said, "Not really." That phrase, "he loved intimidating people," is revealing. At 6 feet 5.5 inches, with an athlete's build and a commanding presence, Chuck Connors was physically imposing, and according to Crawford, he enjoyed using that size to intimidate people. Occasional tensions between Connors and Crawford occurred due to their different personalities, with multiple sources noting this friction. Connors was strong-willed and used to being in control, while Crawford was more laid back. You can imagine how that dynamic might create friction, especially as Crawford grew older and developed his own opinions. But here's what matters. When Chuck Connors died in November 1992, Johnny Crawford served as a pallbearer at his funeral. He delivered a moving eulogy at the memorial service, calling Connors larger than life and a wonderful guy, very intelligent, and a big influence on me. The two had stayed in touch after The Rifleman ended. A story from a 1985 Press Journal interview even describes them herding cattle together for a rancher in Oklahoma. The Rifleman and his TV son, years after the cameras stopped rolling, working cattle together, like they were back on the McCain ranch. Connors could be difficult. He loved intimidating people. He used language that made even a teenager uncomfortable. But he was also capable of maintaining genuine friendships that lasted decades.
One more conflict deserves mention, though this one had nothing to do with anyone Connors actually worked with. In 1977, Connors took on what David Fury's biography calls the most challenging role of his career, playing Tom Moore in the groundbreaking miniseries Roots. Tom Moore was a brutal slave owner who commits terrible acts, including the rape of the character Kizzy, played by Leslie Uggams. Connors played the role with such conviction, such believability, that he earned an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Supporting Actor. He also received hate mail in enormous quantities. Fury's biography states, Connors was so convincing in his portrayal that he received hate mail for his fictional acts in the story, including Moore's rape of Kizzy. Viewers couldn't separate the actor from the character. They were so disturbed by what they saw on screen that they wrote angry letters to Chuck Connors personally, as if he had actually committed these acts. That's a testament to his acting ability in a way. He made people believe, but it also shows how his imposing physical presence, that same quality Johnny Crawford said he loved using to intimidate people, could be used to create a character so despicable that audiences couldn't think rationally about the performance. Roots was drastically different from anything Connors had done before. Lucas McCain, American hero, was playing one of the most evil characters in television history, and he did it so well that people hated him for it. Throughout his career, Chuck Connors' conservative politics created ongoing friction in liberal Hollywood, though it rarely manifested as specific documented feuds. The tension was always there. Campaigning for Barry Goldwater in 1964, marching in a New York City parade supporting the Vietnam War in 1967, campaigning for Gerald Ford in 1976, and campaigning extensively for Ronald Reagan in the 1980s defined his political activism. Reagan was a close personal friend. That friendship with Reagan created one particularly awkward moment. When Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev died in November 1982, Connors asked President Reagan if he could attend the funeral with the American delegation, and after all, Connors and Brezhnev had developed an unlikely friendship based on Brezhnev's love of the Rifleman. Deputy Press Secretary Larry Speakes denied the request. The delegation was limited to Vice President George Bush, Secretary of State George Shultz, and the U.S. Ambassador, which meant there was no room for a television actor, even one who was friends with both the American president and the deceased Soviet leader. Despite his conservative politics, Connors maintained cross-aisle friendships. Liberal producer David Susskind appeared on The Merv Griffin Show in the mid-1960s and called Connors a good friend. And when Griffin noted their political differences, Susskind replied, "We have great arguments. I like him a lot." That's the paradox of Chuck Connors. He could push Larry Cohen off a television show for being some kind of dangerous radical, but he could also maintain a genuine friendship with a liberal like David Susskind. He could refuse sponsor obligations that cost him years of work, but he could also be professional enough on set that even Johnny Crawford, who admitted Connors loved intimidating people, still respected him decades later. 3 marriages defined Chuck Connors' personal life: Elizabeth Riddell from 1948 to 1961, Kamala Devi from 1963 to 1972, and Faith Quabius from 1977 to 1979. All 3 marriages ended in divorce. Someone once asked him if he'd consider a 4th marriage. His response was pure Chuck Connors: "Nope, 3 strikes and you're out." He attributed the failures to being too busy with his career to focus on his marriages, but looking at the pattern of his professional conflicts, you have to wonder if there was more to it than that. This was a man who prioritized his principles over his relationships, professional and personal. He wouldn't compromise for sponsors, he wouldn't compromise for creators with different politics, and apparently he wouldn't compromise in his marriages either. The documentary record paints a consistent portrait: loyalty to friends, professionalism on set when he wanted to be, and charitable work defined his positive side. Running the Chuck Connors Charitable Invitational Golf Tournament with Arnold Palmer and Frank Sinatra, defending teammates for racism during his baseball career, and displaying intelligence and literacy by reciting Shakespeare and the poem Casey at the Bat. Challenging traits existed too. He was physically imposing and enjoyed intimidating people, used heavy profanity, showed strong will to the point of inflexibility, sacrificed business relationships for principle, and dismissed promotional obligations even when those obligations were directly connected to his livelihood. When Chuck Connors died on November 10, 1992, at the age of 71, the obituaries were overwhelmingly positive. No tell-all articles about feuds, no exposés about conflicts, no settling of scores. Hollywood remembered him as a professional, a talent, and a presence. The Larry Cohen story, which only came to full light in Cohen's later interviews, reveals a different side of that legacy. It shows us a man whose political convictions were so strong that he couldn't tolerate working on a show with hidden liberal messaging, even when that show was making him money and advancing his career. It shows us a man whose refusal to play corporate politics cost him years of work, and who only admitted his mistake when it was far too late to matter. It shows us a man who made choices, deliberate and principled choices, that consistently prioritized autonomy over pragmatism.
When we ask who Chuck Connors truly hated more than anyone, the answer isn't as simple as pointing to Larry Cohen. Connors got Cohen removed from Branded, called him some kind of dangerous radical, and that conflict helped destroy what could have been a 5-year series. Hate might be too strong a word for what happened between them, though. This wasn't personal animosity, it was ideological opposition. Connors didn't hate Larry Cohen the person, but hated what Cohen's show represented, what Cohen was trying to say through the character of Jason McCord. And eventually, when both men were older and their careers had taken different paths, they reconciled. Cohen shared that story about Connors expressing regret, wishing he'd treated the sponsor better, and that's not the behavior of a man consumed by hatred. That's the behavior of a man who made a choice, paid the price, and came to understand what it cost him. The real story here isn't about hatred at all. It's about a strong-willed man who refused to compromise, even when compromise would have served him better. It's about how principles, political principles, personal principles, professional principles, can define a career for better and worse. Chuck Connors believed in things. He believed in them strongly enough to lose work over them, believed in them strongly enough to push away collaborators, alienate sponsors, and make career choices that limited his options. Whether you admire that quality or see it as stubbornness probably depends on your own values, but you can't deny it shaped everything about his life and career. The Larry Cohen conflict offers us a window into Hollywood's political tensions during the 1960s, when the blacklist was fading but not forgotten, when liberals and conservatives were fighting over what American entertainment should say and mean. That conflict played out in miniature on the set of Branded, with a liberal creator trying to smuggle subversive messaging into a Western and a conservative star who caught him and shut it down. 48 episodes, that's all Branded got. With better relationships, with more flexibility, with a willingness to compromise on both sides, it could have been 120 episodes, 168 episodes, the kind of run that defines a career. What we got instead was a footnote, what could have been a story, a reminder that in Hollywood, as in life, your principles can be your greatest strength and your fatal flaw. Chuck Connors was the Rifleman to millions of Americans. He was Lucas McCain, the man who always did what was right, who stood up for justice, who never compromised his values. And in the end, Chuck Connors the man lived up to that image more than anyone realized. For better and worse, he never compromised his values either, even when it cost him everything. That's the story of Chuck Connors' greatest professional conflict. Not a tale of hatred, but a tale of principle, politics, and the price of refusing to bend. Thanks for watching.